Have you ever loved someone so deeply that it felt like your entire world revolved around them? Like every text, every glance, every tiny gesture they made could either lift you to the heavens or crush you completely. Maybe it was a partner, a friend, a parent, or even someone you barely knew, but for some reason their presence lingered in your heart like a ghost you couldn't let go. And yet, for all the sweetness, for all the warmth love promises, why does it so often end in loneliness, frustration, or pain? You see, love in its purest form is meant to be a sanctuary, a place of peace, where giving is effortless and connection is genuine. But for most of us, love becomes a cage, a beautiful, invisible chain we willingly wrap around ourselves link by link. We expect them to respond. We expect them to understand. We expect them to care as much, feel as deeply, and move at the exact rhythm of our hearts. And when they don't, when that message isn't returned, when they forget something important, when their eyes no longer linger on us the way they used to, we suffer. It's not the love itself that hurts us. It's the expectation we secretly attach to it. The Buddha once said, "Attachment is the root of suffering." And nowhere is this truth clearer than in the way we love. Most people confuse attachment for love. They believe wanting someone, needing them, craving their attention is a sign of deep affection. But attachment isn't love. It's a form of control. A subtle, desperate attempt to possess something, to keep it fixed, predictable, and forever in our favor. But love isn't meant to be owned. It isn't a transaction. It's a free, unconditioned offering. Imagine holding a bird in your hands. You can cup it gently, feel its warmth, admire its beauty. But the moment you grip too tightly, you harm it. And eventually, you lose it. That's what expectation does to love. In Buddhist teaching, there's a concept called tanha, often translated as craving. It's that restless, gnawing thirst for something outside ourselves. Not just for pleasure or material things, but for validation, for reassurance, for control over what we fear to lose. When we fall in love, tanha quietly sneaks in. We begin craving consistency from a person who, like us, is constantly changing. We crave certainty in a world where nothing is guaranteed. And when reality refuses to cooperate with our fantasy, when people act unpredictably, grow distant, or don't fulfill our silent expectations, we feel betrayed, not by them, but by the story we told ourselves about them. You see, every moment of unspoken expectation we carry is another invisible chain. I knew a woman once who waited by her phone every night for a message from a man she adored. They spoke often, but as time went on, his messages grew shorter, his replies less frequent. Each night she would stare at the screen, heart pounding at every notification. And when nothing came, she would spiral. Was he losing interest? Had she done something wrong? Was she not enough? Her suffering wasn't caused by his silence. It was caused by the story she wrote in her head about what his silence meant. It was the expectation that he should behave a certain way, feel a certain way, prove his affection in the ways she silently demanded. We all do this. And then when our hopes are unmet, we tell ourselves love is dangerous, that it's better to guard our hearts, to withdraw, to stop caring so much. But the truth is, love isn't the enemy, our expectation is. So what if we could love differently? What if we could love not as a transaction, not as a test of worth, but as an act of quiet generosity? The kind of love that says, I see you, I care for you, and whether you return that or not, you are free. It might sound impossible, but it's not. The ancient teachings remind us that the most profound love is the one unbound by demand. It flows because it's its own reward, not a tool for securing someone else's affection. And ironically, when we love this way, when we release people from the prison of our expectations, we find a peace within ourselves that no one can disturb. Imagine waking up one morning and instead of anxiously checking your phone, you silently wish happiness and safety to the one you miss, without needing anything back, without waiting. Imagine offering kindness to a friend, not because you expect loyalty in return, but because it's who you choose to be. Imagine loving as the sun shines, not for applause, not for favor, but simply because it's in your nature to warm the world around you. This is the love Buddhism speaks of, a love without clinging, a love without invisible chains. It's not detached, it's not indifferent, it's a fierce, compassionate, awake kind of love. One that sees clearly that people will come and go, feelings will rise and fade, connections will shift, and yet we remain rooted, open-hearted, and unbroken. This love isn't about what you get, it's about what you give. And in giving without condition, you liberate yourself. So tonight, as you sit in your quiet room, think of someone you've loved or perhaps still love whose absence or distance weighs on your heart. Feel the ache, acknowledge the longing, and then let it be. No demands, no bargaining, no silent hopes, just a simple wish for their happiness wherever they may be. That is the first step, and it's where our journey begins. Somewhere deep inside each of us, there's a longing, a quiet voice that whispers, if only I had this, if only they felt that, then I would finally be okay. It's ancient, older than your childhood, older than any heartbreak you've ever known. This longing is the seed of attachment, and to understand why love so often hurts, we have to trace it back to where it begins. When we enter this world, we arrive helpless. As infants, we're completely dependent for food, for safety, for warmth, for affection. Our earliest experiences of love are transactional. Cry and someone comes. Smile and someone stays. From the very first days of our lives, love and security are tied to conditions. And the mind, innocent but hungry, begins to learn. If I act this way, I am loved. If I look this way, I am accepted. If I fail, I am ignored. It's subtle. No one teaches us this directly. But over time, these quiet patterns shape how we love and how we suffer. In Buddhism, there's a word for this, upadana. It means grasping or fuel for attachment. It's not the object we crave that traps us, it's the grasping. Like a hand that can't stop closing around what it fears to lose. As we grow, this grasping finds new objects, approval, status, affection, certainty. We start believing that happiness comes from securing these things, from having them last, from keeping them consistent. But life, by its very nature, doesn't work like that. People change. Circumstances shift. Feelings rise and fall like waves. And when reality refuses to stay the way, we silently demand the roots of expectation tighten. I remember hearing a story once. A monk asked his teacher, "Why do I suffer so much in love?" And the teacher, without a word, handed him a glass cup. "This cup is already broken," the teacher said. The young monk frowned, confused. "But it's perfectly fine. There's no crack." The teacher smiled. "To me, it's already broken. Not because it's flawed, but because one day it will fall or be dropped or simply decay with time. When you can love something knowing its impermanence, you are free." We too hold people in our hands like that cup. We admire them. We care for them, but secretly we fear losing them. And so we tighten our grip. We build silent expectations. That they'll text us good night. That they'll remember anniversaries. That they'll comfort us the way we want when we want. And when they do, we feel hurt, not because of their action, but because of the invisible contract we wrote in our own minds, without their consent. This is how attachment grows. Not in grand declarations, but in tiny, unnoticed moments of craving. The Buddha explained that expectation is like a chain forged from 5 links. 1, contact, we experience someone or something. 2, feeling, we register it as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. 3, craving, if pleasant, we want more. 4, clinging, we identify with it, make it part of our sense of self. 5, becoming, it shapes our habits, our moods, our relationships. This cycle repeats over and over until one day you realize you're not choosing your attachments anymore. They're choosing you. Have you ever wondered why certain relationships seem to control your mood more than others? Why one person's opinion can ruin your entire day, while another's barely registers? It's because expectation grows wherever craving is strongest. And craving grows wherever you believe your happiness depends on something outside yourself. In modern life, we're taught to pursue love like a transaction. Movies tell us to find the one. Songs tell us to never let go. Social media shows us curated images of perfect dates, perfect partners, perfect lives. And inside, a voice whispers, "Why not me?" Expectation isn't born in emptiness. It's fertilized by comparison, by the stories we tell ourselves about how love should look, how people should act, how we should be treated. And with every unmet expectation, the roots grow deeper. The soil of our hearts hardens. And we begin loving not the person but the idea of them. But here's the thing. Love, real love, isn't an idea. It's not a contract. It's not a guarantee. It's a moment, a breath, a choice. And like every moment, it rises, lives, and passes. When we release the craving for permanence, we discover a love that isn't fragile. A love that doesn't demand but quietly offers. A love that sees the impermanence and loves anyway. The roots of expectation grow in ignorance, in believing we can possess what was never ours to own. But when awareness comes, when we see the cycle, when we catch ourselves gripping too tightly, we get to choose to loosen our hold, to soften our hearts, to love without chains. Tonight, before you sleep, think of one expectation you've silently held towards someone you care about. It could be small, a text you wish they'd desend, a word you hope to hear. And instead of gripping it tighter, offer it up, acknowledge it, smile at it, and let it go, not because you no longer care, but because you care deeply enough to set both of you free. That's how attachment weakens. One moment of awareness, one loosened grip at a time. And in the next chapter, we'll explore exactly how to do that. How to love with open hands and an unshaken heart. Somewhere in the stillness of dawn, before the world remembers its worries, there exists a kind of love untouched by expectation. The ancient sages called it Maitri. It's often translated as loving kindness, but it's far more than that. It's a way of being, a kind of love that asks for nothing in return, a love that simply is. Most of us grew up believing love is a transaction, that kindness should be reciprocated, that affection must be earned. And when we give love, we often wait for gratitude, for recognition, for someone to prove they're worthy of it. But Maitri doesn't bargain, it doesn't keep score, it doesn't cling. It simply offers itself, like sunlight on a quiet morning, touching everything equally, without demand. In the teachings of the Buddha, Maitri is considered the first of the four immeasurables, qualities of the heart so vast they cannot be measured. Maitri, loving kindness. Karuna, compassion. Mudita, sympathetic joy. Upek letter 1E63A macron, equanimity. And Maitri comes first, because it's the soil in which all other qualities grow. It begins not with others, but with yourself. To love others without conditions, you must first learn to sit gently with your own heart, to see the parts of yourself you've ignored, the wounds you've buried, the flaws you've judged, and offer them kindness. This is where most of us struggle. We're often far harsher with ourselves than we'd ever be with a friend. And so we carry an ache, silently believing we must be flawless to be lovable. But Maitri whispers, you are already enough. Not because you've achieved some perfect virtue, but because, like the moon reflecting in still water, your very being carries worth, no matter how turbulent the surface. There's a story in the old Buddhist texts. A young disciple approached the Buddha, his eyes filled with sadness. "Master," he said, "I find it easy to be kind to others but not to myself. How can I learn?" The Buddha smiled and pointed to a small lamp nearby. "See how the lamp gives light to others, yet burns itself away." The disciple nodded. "That's how many people love," the Buddha continued. "But true Maitri is like the sun, it illuminates others and itself at the same time. It asks for nothing, it simply shines." This is the heart of unconditional love. It's not about denying pain. It's not about tolerating harm. It's about offering goodwill without needing control. It means wishing for another's well-being, whether or not they fulfill our hopes, whether or not they stay, whether or not they ever repay our kindness. And this is where most of us hesitate. We worry. If I love like this, won't people take advantage? Won't I be hurt? And it's true, loving unconditionally doesn't guarantee you won't feel pain, but it guarantees you won't be imprisoned by it. Because when love is free of demand, it also becomes free of fear. In Buddhist practice, there's a meditation called Maitri, the cultivation of loving kindness. It begins simply. You sit quietly, you breathe, and then silently you offer a blessing to yourself. May I be happy, may I be healthy, may I be safe, may I live with ease. You let those words touch the tight, guarded places inside you, the parts that say, I'm not enough. The old wounds still tender, the voices of the past. And then slowly you extend those same wishes to others, to a loved one, to a friend, to a stranger, to someone you struggle with without exception. May you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be safe, may you live with ease. Not because they've earned it, not because they agree with you, but because they, too, carry a heart capable of both suffering and joy. This practice isn't about changing others. It's about changing the quality of your own heart, about softening the walls built by fear, about transforming love from something scarce into something boundless. And here's the most beautiful truth. The more you give Maitri, the more you have. Unlike attachment, which shrinks the more you grasp it, Maitri expands as you offer it. And in the quiet space between expectation and acceptance, something remarkable happens. You begin to see people as they are, not as roles to fill or characters in your private story, but as fellow travelers carrying their own griefs, their own longings, their own unseen battles, and the desire to possess them dissolves. You realize you can love without needing to own. You can care without demanding to be cared for. You can offer warmth without insisting it be returned. And this is freedom. There's a reason the Buddha compared Maitri to a mother's love for her only child, not because it's blind, but because it's fierce, enduring, and unconditional. It doesn't wait for perfection. It doesn't hinge on circumstance. It simply loves because to do so is the truest expression of being alive. In modern life, we're taught to guard our hearts, to measure what we give, to retreat at the first sign of risk, but Maitri teaches the opposite. That real safety comes not from walls but from openness, not from control but from acceptance. And so, tonight, before you sleep, place a hand on your chest, feel the quiet pulse beneath your palm, and whisper gently to yourself, may I be happy, may I be safe, may I be free. And then think of someone you love and offer them the same. And perhaps, if your heart feels wide enough, extend that wish to someone you struggle with, not to change them, but to unburden yourself. Because the art of loving without conditions isn't a gift to others, it's a liberation for you. In our next chapter, we'll explore why we crave to possess love in the first place and how this illusion keeps us trapped. But for now, rest in this simple truth. You are capable of a love so vast, it asks for nothing. They say love is the purest feeling, but when expectation sneaks in, even the clearest water turns muddy. We rarely notice the shift. It starts innocently, a hope, a wish, a quiet longing. But over time, that longing hardens, and what once was love becomes demand. You meet someone and your heart blooms. You admire their kindness, their laughter, their stillness. But then, almost unconsciously, the mind whispers, they should always be this way. And so the seed of expectation is planted, tiny, harmless, but given time it grows roots. Expectation is not love, it's love with a contract, unspoken, unwritten, but deeply felt. You do something kind and secretly wait. You offer attention and expect it back. You support someone's dreams and hope they'll stay near forever. But here's the paradox. The more you expect in love, the less free the other person becomes. And without freedom, love begins to rot. Buddhist teachings warn us, attachment dressed as love is still attachment. It binds, it clings, it wants to mold the other into an image we find acceptable. And when they change, as all things must, we suffer, not because love failed, But because our expectations were never real to begin with, we don't set expectations because we're selfish. We do it because we're afraid to be forgotten, afraid to be left behind, afraid that if we don't control love, it will vanish. And so we turn relationships into cages, soft ones built with care, but cages nonetheless. We say things like, "If you really loved me, you would. I did all this for you, why don't you?" But in truth, these are cries from the frightened parts of ourselves, the parts that mistake control for connection. Instead of simply loving, we start measuring. Did they call me back fast enough? Did they say I love you as much as I did? Do they support me the way I support them? Suddenly, love becomes a checklist, and the moment they fall short, we feel betrayed. But here's the painful irony. They didn't betray us. They simply didn't meet an expectation they never agreed to. The Buddha once said, "All suffering begins with desire." And the desire for others to act according to our inner script is one of the most powerful and poisonous forms of it. Real intimacy isn't built on control. It's built on presence, on witnessing someone as they truly are, not as you wish them to be. But when we expect, we stop seeing the person. We see only the role they play. The perfect partner, the supportive friend, the always kind child. And when they fail that role, we punish them. With silence, with distance, with passive resentment, until love feels less like a sanctuary and more like a tightrope. Here's how it usually unfolds. You expected them to notice something. They didn't. You felt hurt. But instead of sharing that pain vulnerably, you lash out. They get defensive. You both build walls. Now love is buried under layers of unspoken judgment, all because of a script no one agreed to act in. The alternative isn't indifference, it's clarity. It's choosing love without the hidden hooks. The Buddha didn't teach us to become emotionally numb. He taught us to love more clearly, more fully, more freely. To love like the sun, not needing anything back to continue shining. This doesn't mean tolerating harm. It means freeing love from the tight grip of control. It means replacing the phrase "they should" with "may they be well in their own way." Try this next time you feel disappointed in someone. Pause. Don't react, just breathe. Then ask yourself, what did I expect them to do? Did they ever agree to that? Is this about them, or my own fear of not being loved? You'll be amazed how much of our pain comes from invisible expectations. When you let go of them, even a little, you create space. Space for curiosity instead of blame. Space for acceptance instead of resistance. Space for a deeper kind of love to arise. The Buddha often used metaphors from nature to describe unconditional love. Think of the ocean. It welcomes every river no matter how muddy. It holds without grasping. It allows the tides to rise and fall without resistance. This is love without expectation. It's not fragile. It doesn't panic when people change. It remains vast, still patient. It knows, nothing in this world belongs to me, and yet I can love it all. There's a story of a monk who fell in love with a lotus in a nearby pond. Every morning he'd go and admire its beauty. One day, the lotus withered. The monk sat beside it quietly without sadness. A young novice asked him, "Aren't you upset? You came here every day." The monk smiled and said, "I came to love, not to possess. When the lotus was here, I loved it. Now it's gone, I love the space it leaves behind." That's the wisdom of Maitri. That's love unpoisoned by expectation. In the next chapter, we'll ask the question that often haunts those who dare to love without expectation. But what about me? We'll explore how selflessness in love doesn't mean abandoning yourself, but discovering a deeper wholeness within. But for now, sit with this truth: expectation isn't love, and letting go doesn't mean losing. It means returning to the purity that was always there. Why do we keep falling into the same pattern? We love, we expect, we suffer. Then we promise ourselves, next time I won't get attached. But before we realize it, the cycle starts again. Why is it so difficult to love freely without the chains of expectation? The Buddha taught that our minds are like wild horses. Without awareness, they run wherever old habits take them. And unless we hold the reins gently with mindfulness, we repeat the same old paths of clinging, demanding, and despair. The key to breaking this cycle lies in mindful loving. But what does that truly mean? Mindful loving isn't passive. It's not about suppressing emotions or pretending to be indifferent. It's about being fully present with what love feels like, without rushing to control it, own it, or secure it. It means witnessing your own reactions, the little surge of hope when they smile at you, the sharp sting of hurt when they forget something important, the quiet resentment when they don't meet an invisible standard you carried in your heart. And instead of drowning in those emotions, you simply notice them, like watching clouds drift across an endless sky. When you love mindfully, you see the joy of connection, the tendency to cling, the fear of loss, the urge to demand. You no longer move through love half asleep. You wake up to every sensation it brings, without letting it sweep you away. This awareness creates a sacred pause, a space between feeling and reacting. In that space, you can choose to love without a hidden contract, to give without measuring what comes back, to hold without squeezing too tight. Most of us carry old love stories in our heads. People always leave. If they loved me, they would know what I need. Love hurts. Without awareness, these stories control us. We enter new relationships still bleeding from old wounds. But mindfulness allows us to see these stories as just that, stories, not ultimate truths, not the laws of the universe, just echoes from the past. And in that seeing is freedom. You can respond freshly to the person in front of you, instead of to the ghosts behind you. Whenever you feel a wave of expectation rising, practice the loving pause. It takes just a moment. Breathe. Feel the air entering your body, anchoring you in this moment. Notice, what expectation just appeared? Is it fair? Is it rooted in fear? Let go, not by force, but by seeing its weight. Ask yourself, would I rather cling to this expectation or feel peace? Most times you'll choose peace. And in that choice, you begin breaking the ancient pattern. In Buddhist tradition, every interaction is a chance to awaken, even and especially in love. Mindful loving transforms ordinary moments. A glance becomes a meditation on presence. A disagreement becomes a lesson in ego and surrender. A goodbye becomes a teaching on impermanence. The person you love becomes your mirror, reflecting both your beauty and your attachments. In this way, love isn't just a feeling, it's a path, a fierce, tender, illuminating path. Mindful loving doesn't mean becoming a saint overnight. You will still feel jealousy, frustration, longing. That's natural. The goal is not perfection. It's tenderness toward yourself in those moments. When you notice yourself clinging, smile. When you catch yourself demanding, breathe. Remember, even the Buddha was once a prince who longed for certainty and control. We're all learning. Compassion isn't just for others. It begins with the self. One reason we cling so tightly is because we secretly believe things will last forever. And we're terrified they won't. But Buddhist wisdom reminds us, nothing is permanent, not even love. And that's not a cause for sadness, it's liberation. When you accept impermanence, you stop wasting time trying to freeze perfect moments. You savor them as they come, like cherry blossoms in spring. They're precious because they're fleeting. Mindful loving honors this truth. It celebrates without grasping. It lets go without bitterness. Imagine love not as a tightrope, but as a vast, open sky. Expectations are like clouds that come and go. The sky doesn't chase the clouds. It simply holds space for them. This is the heart of mindful loving. It holds space for joy, disappointment, desire, letting go. It welcomes it all without closing in. And in doing so, it breaks the old cycle. In one ancient tale, the Buddha spoke of a young woman who lost the man she loved. She came to him weeping. "How can I love again when loss is certain?" The Buddha replied, "Love as the earth loves. The earth holds both flowers and thorns. It does not reject the thorn for fear of the pain. This is mindful loving, not naive, not detached, but courageously open. You don't need to renounce the world or abandon your relationships. You only need to begin with a single breath. Right here, right now, feel it. This is your moment of choice. Will you repeat the old story? Or will you step off the wheel and love with awareness? The path to mindful loving isn't distant. It's beneath your feet with every interaction. In our next chapter, we'll explore what happens when we truly let go of our need for control and love, and how that opens the door to a deeper, more enduring connection than we ever imagined. But for now, stay here, with this breath, with this heart, with this love. We often speak of love as a feeling, a warmth in the heart, a longing in the chest, a sweetness in the eyes, but love isn't meant to stay inside us. It's meant to be lived, to move, to become action. The Buddha taught that true love is not what you feel, it's what you do. And the purest form of love is this: love without strings. Most of us, without realizing it, tie little invisible strings to every act of affection. I'll be kind if they appreciate it. I'll be patient if they behave the way I expect. I'll forgive if they ask for it first. These strings are conditions, and where conditions grow, suffering follows. The Buddha described this as conditional loving, a love that binds both the giver and the receiver in silent contracts. We think we are giving, but we are also waiting for thanks, waiting for recognition, waiting for a return. And when it doesn't come, resentment quietly takes root. In Buddhist teaching, true love is dana, a gift freely given, not a trade, not a bargain, not a tool for control. When you give love as a gift, you release it from your grasp. You don't demand a particular reaction. You don't track how many times you've given versus received. You love because it is your nature to love, because it brings peace to your heart, because in giving, you become whole. It's easy to love when people meet our expectations, when they're kind, attentive, grateful, but unconditional love, that takes courage. To keep offering tenderness in the face of indifference, to keep forgiving when apologies don't come, to keep showing up, not because you'll be rewarded, but because it's what your awakened heart chooses. This isn't weakness, it's the highest strength. The Buddha called this metta boundless, fearless loving kindness, a love that radiates outward, asking nothing in return. So how do we turn this into a lived practice? Start small. A kind word to a stranger, expecting no reply. A silent blessing for someone who irritates you. A thoughtful gesture for a loved one, not to earn affection but to express yours. Notice the little expectations that creep in, and then let them go. Feel the lightness of giving without calculation. That is mindful, fearless, actionable love. There's a tale in the ancient sutras of a woman named Visakha, renowned as one of the Buddha's most devoted followers. She would care for the sick, feed the hungry, and support the Sangha tirelessly. One day someone asked her, "Why do you give so much? Don't you wish for recognition or blessings in return?" Visakha smiled and replied, "I give not for heaven or favor, but because a heart that loves needs no reward." In that simple statement lies the entire essence of loving in action. One reason we attach strings to love is fear. We fear that if we don't ask for something back, we'll be empty, forgotten, left behind. But Buddhist wisdom reminds us, the more you give freely, the more abundant your heart becomes. Love isn't a finite resource, it's a wellspring. Every act of unconditional love strengthens you, not weakens you. It builds resilience, it deepens joy, it dissolves loneliness. And in time, you'll find you need less from others, because you've already given yourself the greatest gift, the freedom to love without chains. When you shift from expectation to loving in action, your relationships change, conflicts soften, resentments fade, moments of connection grow deeper. Why? Because the other person feels safe, safe to be imperfect, safe to make mistakes, safe to be human. And in that space, love flourishes, not the love of ownership, not the love of control, but the love of two free beings choosing, again and again, to meet each other with kindness. This practice isn't limited to lovers or family. You can offer love in action to a lonely stranger at a bus stop, a colleague who feels unseen, a street dog in the rain, the earth itself as you tread gently across it. The scope of your love is limitless, and each small act is a thread, weaving you into the great tapestry of compassion the Buddha envisioned. Before we close this chapter, pause a moment. Is there someone you've withheld love from because you believed they didn't deserve it, or because you feared it wouldn't be returned? Picture them, and now quietly in your mind offer them a blessing. May you be happy, may you be safe, may you be at peace. Feel the weight of old grudges lift. Feel the strings you once held begin to dissolve. This is loving in action, invisible but immense in its power. To love without strings is to walk lightly in this world, unburdened by unspoken deals, unafraid of loss, unmoved by the need for constant validation. It's to trust that love, like sunlight, need not be clung to warm you. It radiates, touches, and continues, and you, in loving, become part of that radiance. In our final chapter, we'll return to where we began, to ask ourselves, what does it truly mean to live a life of love without expectation? But for now, breathe, feel your heart, and perhaps before this day ends, find one small, quiet way to love in action, no strings attached. We began this journey with a simple question. What happens when we love without expectation? Across centuries of Buddhist wisdom, across sutras and ancient stories, one truth keeps returning: freedom. Not the fleeting freedom of getting what you want, but the lasting freedom of no longer needing to. Expectations feel natural. We love, we hope. We give, we wish. And slowly, quietly, we begin to build invisible chains. If they say this, I'll feel good. If they do this, I'll be satisfied. If the world treats me this way, I'll be happy. But as the Buddha taught, everything in this world is anicca, impermanent, shifting, out of our control. To stake our peace on what others give back is to build a house on sand. Letting go isn't about giving up on people. It's about releasing our grip on outcomes. It's saying, I will love you whether you notice or not. I will be kind even if you forget to be. I will give without asking when it will return. This isn't weakness, it's clarity. When we let go of expecting others to complete us, we realize we were whole all along. The Buddha once told his monks a story. A man comes upon a wide, dangerous river. On his side, wild beasts, darkness. On the other, safety, peace. He gathers branches and vines, builds a raft, and crosses. When he reaches the far shore, he feels grateful. But then he thinks, this raft served me so well, I cannot leave it behind. So he drags it with him through the forest, over hills, across valleys, and it slows him, exhausts him. The Buddha asked his monks, is this man wise, carrying the raft after it has served its purpose? They answered, no, master. And so it is with the expectations we carry. They may have once felt useful protection against loneliness, fear, or pain. But the longer we cling, the heavier they become. A heart without expectation is light. It laughs more easily. It forgives without keeping score. It rests in the present moment. Buddhist masters say, to let go is not to lose love, but to finally set it free. And when love is free, it expands. It reaches strangers. It softens enemies. It heals old wounds in silence. When you let go of expectation, your happiness no longer depends on others. You experience connection without fear. You give without calculation. You love more deeply because you're not trying to control the story. This is the way of the awakened heart. Not a cold detachment, but a tender, fearless openness. Tonight, before sleep, try this. Close your eyes. Bring to mind someone you care for. Notice if there's anything you're hoping they'll say, do, or become. Now, silently say, I release you from my expectations. I love you as you are in this moment. Feel the space that opens within you. That lightness is your natural state, and it was always yours to return to. A wandering monk once approached the Buddha and asked, Master, what is the sign of one who has found true freedom? The Buddha smiled and held up an empty alms bowl. Like this bowl, he said, when one lets go of clinging, they can hold the entire sky. But to empty ourselves of grasping is not to be without love. It is to hold love vast enough for the world. So here, At the close of this journey, we return to where we began. You don't need to wait to love without expectation. You don't need perfect circumstances or perfect people. In every breath, every glance, every ordinary day, you can choose to untie one string. You can choose love not as a currency, but as the boundless nature of your heart. This is the true freedom the Buddha spoke of, the freedom of letting go. If this story, this practice, this ancient wisdom meant something to you today, I invite you to help share it. Click like to let this teaching ripple out to more hearts. Subscribe to our channel, Zen Buddhism Wisdom, for weekly insights just like this. And tell us in the comments, what are you ready to let go of today? Your story might be the light someone else needs. Until next time, may you be well. May you be free. May you love without expectation.